In this video, I want to talk a little bit about the mortality rate of bass tournaments and if this is actually starting to impact our fisheries. I also want to talk a little bit about the mortality rate in general, and also, is catch, weigh, release the answer? We've seen a lot of kayak tournaments go to catch, weigh, release. We've seen some organizations like Major League Fishing do a catch, weigh, release. Is this the answer? And I actually have a lot of data, a lot of statistics. If you guys have been around the Bass Fishing HQ channel, you know that I love actual studies, factual studies, data that we get, and there have been numerous. For the last 30 years, tournament mortality rates have been studied over and over and over again. And so I'm gonna let you guys know a little bit about that in this video. Now, before we get into the video, real quickly, this one's brought to you by my apparel company, and more specifically, the Fin Fishing Rod Glove. This is a rod glove that not only protects your rods, but is made out of neoprene. So it actually helps to prevent getting snagged with every other lures. I'm sure if you guys have a rod locker with a bunch of these in it, you hate when you get all of your baits tangled up. This neoprene fabric really helps prevent that. If a hook does get in it, they easily pop out. You don't have to spend 20 minutes pulling a rod out of your rod locker. So I'm gonna leave a link down below in the description for the Fin Fishing Rod Glove. Pick some up and you can help support this channel. All right, let's talk about bass mortality. And one of the biggest reasons that I wanted to talk specifically about this is because I constantly see, not necessarily on my channel, but across the board on a lot of different channels in the comment section, you will hear a lot of guys say that, the reason maybe it's tougher to catch fish or whatever is because all these tournaments are killing a lot of the fish. And there is no question that there is a mortality rate associated with tournament fishing. Now, there have been a ton of studies, and I'm gonna link probably 4 or 5 different studies down below in the description. If you guys wanna read through them, I'm gonna let you know that every scientific paper I've ever read is the worst thing to read. They use a lot of scientific jargon, so you kind of have to sift through it. But I have read a ton of papers on this. And the first thing that I've noticed is that, one, bass mortality rates are going to depend greatly on the fishery as well as the time of the year. There's been tournaments documented where 68% of the fish weighed in that tournament have died. Now, that particular tournament actually happened in the middle of summer, way down in the south, okay? And so in that example, you have really hot water, you have fish that are being caught primarily in a little bit deeper water, being put into that warmer water, being drug around a boat all day. And yeah, of course, a lot of fish are gonna die in that situation. But also, if you have a tournament where you are fishing and the water is under 68 degrees, that seems to be the special mark, kind of between 68 and 75 degrees. If the water temperature is below that, your mortality rates are way low. I'm talking a lot of times between 1 and 3%. So in those situations, the overall bass mortality of a tournament is not going to affect a fishery at all. Now, with that being said, what I've kind of seen to be an average mortality rate when you look at all the papers and you kind of take into account all these different tournaments is right around the 25 to 30% mark. So you're talking about if you catch 4 or 5 fish, more than likely in that tournament, 1 or 2 of them are gonna die, which seems very high. 25%, 1 out of 4, 30%, almost 1 out of 3 die. And a lot of this is not dying at the weigh-in. Most of this is dying a couple of days after they are released. And they've done a ton of studies where they release these fish, they keep them fairly close in large pens. They also have put tracking systems in them to be able to see which fish die. And so these rates are pretty accurate. About 25, maybe even 30% of fish brought to a weigh-in will end up dying. So a lot of anglers, when they hear that, they are going to more or less freak out, because they think that a lot of these fish are being caught and being killed, and that is having a drastic effect on the fishery. Now, if you fish really small fisheries, you know, where it might be a couple 100-acre lake and you have bass tournaments out there, this is where this is going to have the greatest impact, is on these smaller fisheries. But if you fish more of your normal size lakes and definitely your larger lakes, guys, the data is there. Tournament mortality does not impact the overall population of the fisheries. On the average, you're talking about 1 to 4% of the overall mortality of bass happens because of tournament fishing. Now, with that being said, another really important thing that you should know is that roughly about 30% of the entire bass population dies every single year just because of natural reasons. They just die because they get old, they get diseases, they just die. You know, and so that is a huge, like, that's an actual big part of the population that dies. But you also have to think of the recruitment that happens every single year, because every single year bass go up into the shallow water, they spawn, they give birth. Now, a very small percentage of the eggs that are laid actually make it to adulthood, but it is typically enough to sustain large populations. If you look at a lot of lakes, especially lakes that have, you know, a decent amount of cover, most of the time lakes that have, you know, grass in them or a lot of cover, their populations have only gone up over the last several years, over the last 30 years. You know, in those lakes that don't have a huge population of bass and they don't have, you know, maybe adequate cover in the lakes, those are where you see more of those declines in the lakes. So that is something that is really, really important to understand, is that like a large majority of the bass die every year just because of natural causes. Now, the other thing that I hear a lot thrown around is the idea of catch, weigh, release, and how catch, weigh, release is by far way more important and the best thing that we can do for our fisheries. Now, I want you to know that I do think it would be better for our fisheries, but saying that it is way better for our fisheries is actually fairly false. You know, there's been a lot of studies done where all they did was they looked at bass that were caught, weighed, and released. Actually, not even weighed. They were caught and released right away. So like your typical fisherman going out at a pond, catching a fish, around 22% of almost every bass that gets caught at times can die. Like in this study, they saw that 22% of every bass caught and released right away ended up dying. And the reason that this happened was typically because this fish was hooked abnormally. I mean, all of us have gone out there, if you've been fishing for any amount of time, you've deep hooked a fish in the gut. You've left a hook maybe at times in a fish. Maybe you catch that fish and it's bleeding because it got nicked on the gills. Those fish, a lot of those fish end up dying, no matter if you release them right away. To me, this is something that I think at times is a little bit funny, because you know, we watch Major League Fishing and I will see anglers catch a fish that's bleeding and they release that fish back into the lake thinking that they did that fish a humongous service. That because they simply released that fish back into the water that it was caught out of, that they actually helped that fish to live. And the fact is that if that fish is bleeding, it's not going to stop bleeding just because you release it back into the lake. And because it keeps bleeding, it will bleed out and it will die. The only thing is you don't see it. When someone from, you know, Major League Fishing releases a fish that's bleeding right away, they never see that fish again. They move on. And so everyone's like, oh, yay, they helped that fish. That fish is dead. Like almost 100% of the time, that fish is dead. And I think that it's funny at times that people applaud that, thinking that they helped out that fish. Now, to me, the best way to help that fish is to stop the bleeding. And there's actually a lot of live well treatments like G-juice, for example, that help coagulate that blood and actually get it to stop bleeding. I'm actually a firm believer in Mountain Dew. Now, the thing that's weird about Mountain Dew is that people have said that it actually doesn't help, but I have saved so many fish over the years that I've been fishing by, if it's bleeding, if I hook it in the gill and it's bleeding, or hooked in the tongue, I keep Mountain Dew with me all the time for that exact reason. I will dump Mountain Dew on that fish It seems to coagulate the blood. You will literally see a fish gushing blood and it will completely stop. And that, helping that fish to stop bleeding is what's going to save that fish. So in my opinion, I've always thought it is funny that people always applaud that like it is the absolute answer. Now, in general, is 22% of death better than 25 to 30%? Yes. So is catch, weigh, release better for the fishery? I'm gonna have to say absolutely. But is it by far like way better? I don't know exactly, you know, because I think a lot of these fish still die if they are hooked deeply. And so, guys, I'm just trying to bring you a little bit of stuff that I have read. Like I said, I will leave these articles down below for you guys to read and kind of make your own assumptions about. Because again, there's a lot of fish that die, and you see a ton of lakes that just continue to do well. And it's because, more or less, a lot of times because of the cover that is in a lake. If a lake has a lot of grass in it, that's why I hate all these, you know, DNRs that are just spraying out of control. Because when you're killing all that grass that is in a lake, it really hurts the fish population more than anything, way more than tournament fishing. So, guys, if you want to understand all of this a little bit more, I'm gonna leave a link for a video that I did on BassFishingHQ where I kind of thoroughly went through a lot of these statistics. I'm gonna leave it right here. So if you guys wanna watch that next, go ahead and click on it, and I will see you guys tomorrow.